Speaker needs no introduction. From the great state of Texas, Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, if you ask me where I come from, here's what I tell everyone. I was born by God's dear grace in an extraordinary place where the stars and stripes and the eagle fly. It's a big old land with countless dreams, and happiness ain't out of reach. It's off the way it should. Yeah, I've seen enough to know that we've got it good, where the stars and stripes and the eagle fly. There's a lady that stands, and there's a bell that still echoes the price that it costs to be free. I pledge allegiance to this flag, and if that bothers you, well, that's too bad. But if you got pride and you're proud you do, hey, we could use some more like me and you. There's a lady that stands in a harbor for what still echoes the price that it costs.
God bless the great state of South Carolina. Now, how many of y'all watched the debate this week? How fantastic is it that we have so many young, talented, dynamic Republican candidates running for president? And what a contrast with the Democrats. I'm pretty sure the first Democratic debate consisted of Hillary and the Chipotle clerk. We can't forget about Bernie Sanders. So now the Democratic field consists of a wild-eyed socialist whose ideas are dangerous for America and the world, and Bernie Sanders. And has anyone else noticed that they keep scheduling the Democratic debates at like 1:30 in the morning on a Saturday? They air it on Alaska PBS. It's almost like they don't want anyone to see their candidates. But there is good news. They have announced the location of the next Democratic debate. They're going to host it at Leavenworth. They wanted to make it easier for Hillary to attend. I'm so glad to be back with all of y'all. I want to start by just giving thanks for news we got today that 4 Americans are coming home from Iran. Four Americans, including Pastor Saeed Abedini. So many of us have been lifting up Pastor Saeed in our prayers. You know, I've gotten to know his wife, Name, who is a wonderful, wonderful person, who has stood like a rock while Pastor Saeed was wrongly imprisoned, who's raised their 2 little kids in Idaho while her husband languished in an Iranian prison. So we give thanks to God that they're coming home. But at the same time, we've got to shake our head at how it's happening. You know, the details of this deal are still coming out. You notice that the Obama administration announces the good news and then hides the bad news? So the details that are still coming out, but from what we understand, we're releasing 7 people who were incarcerated for violating the sanctions on Iran and helping Iran develop nuclear weapons. And there are another dozen or more who violated the law that we've agreed we're just not going to prosecute. And let me say, there is a false moral equivalence in a deal like this. Saeed was imprisoned for the crime of preaching the gospel. He shouldn't have been there. Amir Hekmati, a U.S. Marine, shouldn't have been there in that prison. Jason Rezian, a reporter who was imprisoned for reporting on the news, shouldn't have been there. And so, while we celebrate their return, this deal serves as a piece of propaganda for both Iran and the Obama administration. You noticed every compliant reporter will say, well, isn't this Iranian deal wonderful? Let me tell you, 3 years ago, I introduced legislation that said the unconditional release of American hostages should be the first step in the precondition before beginning any conversation with Iran. You know, we saw this past week when Iran captured 2 ships, imprisoned 10 sailors, tried to humiliate them. President Obama and John Kerry celebrate. How wonderful, after humiliating our sailors, they let them go. No, it is not wonderful. They shouldn't have been captured in the first place. And I will tell you, that image of 10 brave sailors forced to their knees, that image will summarize the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy more powerful than any image from the last 7 years. Let me ask something. How many people here have been burned by politicians? Us have had the experience where we have a politician, they come up, they campaign, and they sound great. They say everything we want to hear. And we vote for them. And they go to Washington and they don't do what they said. And let me say, that hadn't happened once, hadn't happened twice. It happens over and over and over again. Now listen, the stakes in 2016 have never been higher. Our country is hanging in the balance. So I've got a very simple question for the folks here. How do we not get burned again? All right, I wasn't fishing for that. There is no more important question in this primary than how do we not get burned again? Because you know what? Every single Republican running knows what you're supposed to say. Did you notice that nobody on that debate stage gets up and says, I'm a squishy establishment moderate, I stand for nothing? None of them say that. When someone announces as Republican candidate for president, suddenly they agree with the values of everyone in this room. And let me suggest a simple rule. Ignore what all of us say. Ignore what I say. Ignore what every other candidate says. Don't listen to the words on the campaign trail. Look to action. You know, I had a former boss who used to say, if I'm ever accused of being a Christian, I'd like for there to be enough evidence to convict me. True of being a conservative. If you're really a conservative, if you're really a constitutionalist, you shouldn't have to tell anybody. Because you will bear the scars. You will have been in the foxholes, in the fight. You will have been standing for your principles. And it will be evident for everyone to see. If you agree with me that the stakes have never been higher, then I want to suggest a metric to apply to every candidate. This is a time for choosing, and I'm going to highlight 7 times for choosing, 7 battles in recent years where every candidate for public office had a choice of where to stand. Let's start with the fight over Obamacare. In 2013, millions of Americans rose up against the disaster that was Obamacare. Obamacare was getting ready to be implemented, and you know what? Republican leadership decided they didn't want to fight. They were scared of fighting. They didn't want to stand up and fight. When millions of Americans rose up, I was proud to stand alongside millions of Americans fighting to stop Obamacare. You know, a journalist today wrote a column saying, Cruz doesn't talk about the shutdown anymore. Well, if you recall, Washington, D.C. was terrified to fight, but because millions of us stood up together and lit up the phones for one brief moment, we saw a hint of a backbone appear in Congress. You know, all of us were taught in junior high that invertebrates can't walk upright. And yet politicians disprove that every single day. And let me suggest that time for choosing. If you want to know, by the way, every Republican candidate for president says they'll repeal Obamacare. They'll also offer to sell you a bridge. You want to know who's really going to repeal Obamacare? You want to know who's willing to bleed and stand? In 2013, ask of every candidate on that stage, where were you when the fight was being fought and the American people were standing up to Washington? If you weren't there, if you didn't stand up, if you didn't engage, well, that tells you something. Let's look at a second time for choosing. The fight over guns, following the horrific shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. President Obama and Chuck Schumer came out with an aggressive new national gun control plan. You know, the president could have tried to unify us. He could have brought us together and say, let's focus on violent criminals. Let's come after violent criminals, come down on them like a ton of bricks. That would have brought us together. That would have been the right thing to do to stop the murderers and rapists and criminals. But President Obama didn't do that. Instead, he pursued a partisan agenda to try to take away the right to keep and bear arms of millions of law-abiding Americans. In response to that, millions of us across the country rose up to defend our constitutional rights. I was proud to stand and lead that fight. And to the utter astonishment, to the shock and dismay of Barack Obama and Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer, who were triumphant, when it came time to a vote, every single one of their proposals to undermine the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms was voted down on the Senate floor. Now, once again, in a Republican presidential race, every Republican candidate will stand up on that stage and say they support the Second Amendment. There are no dum-dums on that stage. There is a simple test to apply to distinguish campaign rhetoric from an actual record. In 2013, when Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid were trying to take away our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, where were you? Did you stand up and fight? Or were you otherwise engaged? If you want to know where someone is, look to their actions. Let's take a third example. Amnesty. Now, in this election, there are a lot of folks who want to talk about immigration, want to talk about securing the borders. I think that's fabulous. I think that's fabulous that people are finally focused on the reality that border security is national security. But we had a battle in 2013 led by Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and far too many establishment Republicans in Washington. And then on the other side, millions of Americans rose up and said no. We don't want amnesty. We want to secure our borders and protect the American people. And we had incredible heroes and warriors leading that battle, people like Jeff Sessions and Steve King, who stood heroically with the American people. Now, I'll tell you, I was proud to be shoulder to shoulder with Jeff Sessions and Steve King leading the fight. And when it came time for the votes, remember, by the way, they push it through the Senate, and Republican leadership planned to jam it through the House. It was about to pass. It was going to happen. The issue was lost. All of the reporters were listening to the Democrats crow triumphant. How Republican leadership would join with all the Democrats to pass amnesty, Obama would sign it, and the battle would be over. Now, if any candidate for president says he or she really cares about immigration, when we are on the verge of losing the major battle, when the fight will be over if this bill is signed into law, then it's no longer a question of talking points. It's a choice of where do you stand. And I will say this, anybody who was AWOL from the battle on the Gang of Eight has no standing as a candidate now to say they will enforce the border. Your actions speak much, much louder than your words. Let me give a fourth issue, a set of issues that gave rise to the birth of the Tea Party. It's a combination of TARP, the stimulus, and cronyism in Washington. Corporate welfare. That is what fomented this incredible grassroots movement of the Tea Party, fed up with bailing out Wall Street and ignoring Main Street and the working men and women of this country. Now, in my time in the Senate, I have been proud to stand over and over and over again with the American people fighting against cronyism, fighting against the mandates, fighting against bailouts. No bailouts for any bank. Period. No subsidies, no mandates. Stop picking winners and losers. And let me say, if someone tells you they're Tea Party, you can't be Tea Party and at the same time have supported TARP. You can't be Tea Party and at the same time have supported Barack Obama's stimulus. You can't be Tea Party and at the same time support the ethanol mandate because it's good politics in Iowa, and support the sugar subsidies because it's good politics in Florida, and support all of the other corporate welfare and cronyism. So if you really want to know what kind of president is someone going to be, are they going to take on the Washington cartel? Are they going to take on the lobbyists? You can ask yourself the simple question, where did they stand on TARP and the stimulus and cronyism and corporate welfare? And if they weren't willing to take it on when the fights were being fought, I can tell you no one in history ever grew a backbone after they got to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Let me give you a fifth time for choosing. And it's marriage and religious liberty. Last year, the Supreme Court, 5 unelected judges issued a lawless, fundamentally illegitimate decision purporting to tear down the marriage laws of all 50 states. Now, when that decision came down, there was a time for choosing for everyone. Where do you stand? Which side of the line are you on? By the way, our friends in the media, they want us to give up on this fight. Oh, they celebrate your enlightened wisdom to allow in marriage, the foundation of the family from millennia, from the very beginning, from Adam and Eve, to celebrate tearing down marriage. The media praises you when you're so enlightened as to want to tear down the fundamental building blocks of the family and society. But that decision provided every candidate with a choice. And I'll tell you, quite a few of the candidates standing on that debate stage stood up and said, the Supreme Court's decision is the settled law of the land. We need to accept it, surrender, and move on. Now, those are word for word Barack Obama's talking points. Any Republican who responded to that decision by saying it's the settled law of the land, move on. We know for a fact, as president, they will not defend marriage. They've told us that. Do not be surprised. How do you not get burned again? Don't listen to the words. Listen to what they've done. If they've surrendered the fight on marriage at the outset, they ain't going to be there in the future. And when it comes to the assault on religious liberty, our first liberty, the very first right protected in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, if you want to know if someone will stand with pastors, someone will stand with rabbis, someone will stand with priests, someone will stand with you and me and protect our fundamental right to seek out and worship God Almighty with all of our hearts, minds, and souls, then don't listen to their words on the campaign trail. Ask, when have you stood and fought for religious liberty? Talk's cheap. It's easy to say it. When have you stood and fought to defend the 10 Commandments, to defend the Pledge of Allegiance, to defend veterans' memorials that honor the men and women who gave their lives for this country? When the government comes and subpoenas pastors as they did in my home city of Houston? Did you stand with the pastors? Or did you stay out of the fray? The sixth fight, the sixth time for choosing that matters, is the battle over Planned Parenthood. Y'all remember the debate at the Reagan Library? Where just about every candidate looked in the TV camera and gave an emotional speech about how important it was to stop Planned Parenthood. In light of these horrific videos in which they're caught on tape essentially admitting to a pattern of felonies, illegally selling the body parts of unborn children. Every candidate just about said, gosh, this is terrible. Well, just a few weeks later, we had a knockdown, drag-out fight in Washington, D.C. over exactly this issue. Millions of Americans rose up. I was part of reaching out to over 100,000 pastors nationwide, asking the pastors to pray for this country and to light up the phones and call their members of Congress. I was proud to stand with millions of Americans saying, enough is enough on Planned Parenthood. Now, let me say something. Of the other very fine individuals on that debate stage, none of them were anywhere to be found. That was a moment. Can you imagine how different that fight would have been if every major presidential candidate had descended on Washington, D.C., had stood in unison and said, Mitch McConnell and John Boehner don't send $500 million of taxpayer funding to Planned Parenthood. And there are candidates on that stage that right now today say we should continue to send taxpayer funds to Planned Parenthood. Nobody should be surprised if you get burned. If you're not willing to stand up when the fight is happening, you're not going to do anything different if you ever get elected. And by the way, anyone who says the marriage decision is the settled law of the land, anyone who is afraid to stand up to Planned Parenthood, I'll tell you right now, every Supreme Court justice they name will be a disaster. Are you fed up with Republicans nominating liberals to the Supreme Court? Well, you've got direct power over that, which is don't support anyone who's run away from the fight on life and marriage, because if you're not willing to stand and fight on life and marriage, every judge you put on the court is going to be a disaster. Why? Because you're going to curry favor with the New York Times instead of standing with the American people. And let me give you the seventh and final time for choosing. And it's the battle over Iran. The single greatest national security threat facing Iran, facing this country, is the threat of a nuclear Iran. We saw this week just how profoundly dangerous it is after Iran captures our ships, after they attempt to humiliate our sailors. What does Barack Obama do? Turns around and wants to give the Ayatollah Khamenei $150 billion. I got an idea. How about we sell them our ships? $75 billion apiece. Look, this is shameful. It is wrong. I'll tell you this. If I'm elected president, our sailors will never be on their knees.
We need to understand. We need to.
press is going to report that we heard black helicopters. Any Islamic terrorist, any Islamic tyrant who attempts to capture U.S. servicemen and women will face the full force and fury of the United States of America. We will not bargain with terrorists. We will not negotiate with terrorists. We will not, as Barack Obama does, apologize for terrorists. Instead, if you are a radical Islamic militant, and I would note, they are radical Islamic militants. Last I checked, it wasn't a bunch of Presbyterians who flew the planes into the Twin Towers. If you are a militant anywhere on the face of the planet, and you go and join ISIS, you go and wage jihad against the United States of America and attempt to murder Americans, you are signing your death warrant. But we've had a moment where this battle was being fought on Iran. Asks of the candidates running, who has stepped forward to lead stopping this Iranian deal? Who has stepped forward to delve into the details, to understand what's going on, to understand what we need to do to prevent the Ayatollah Khamenei from ever getting a nuclear weapon? If that fight is not important enough for someone to step forward and lead, what fight will be? Let me tell you, if I'm elected president, on the very first day I pledge to do 5 things. Number 1, rescind every single illegal and unconstitutional executive action. Number 2, instruct the U.S. Department of Justice to open an investigation into Planned Parenthood and prosecute any criminal violations. Number 3, instruct the Department of Justice and the IRS and every other federal agency that the persecution of religious liberty ends today. Number 4, rip to shreds this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal. And number 5, begin the process of moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, the once and eternal capital of Israel. Now, for every one of us that agrees, the stakes have never been higher. And for every one of us that raised our hands and said we've been burned before by politicians who've made promises and haven't done it, how can you know that I will follow through on those promises on the first day in office and every day afterwards? As the scripture has said, you shall know them by their fruits. And any candidate on that stage, no matter how much you might like them when they're campaigning, if they haven't stood and fought at those 7 times for choosing, if they haven't been willing to stand and lead, you can know to an absolute fact they wouldn't do so as president either. If we want to see another John Boehner in the White House, then we shouldn't look to people's records. We should listen to what they say. But if we can't get burned again, we should ignore all the campaign rhetoric from everyone and simply say who's been walking the walk, who's demonstrated through action where they stand. I want to give you one final word of encouragement. I've said many, many times, I think today, 2016 is very, very much like 1980. The parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. It took Jimmy Carter to give us Ronald Reagan. And I am convinced the most long-lasting legacy of Barack Obama is going to be a new generation of leaders in the Republican Party that stand for the Constitution, that stand for freedom, and that stand with the people. Thank you, and God bless you.